I remember sitting in an English class at UC Santa Cruz in 1988, studying a poem by Adrienne Rich. Suddenly, I realized I was in its thrall. I didn't know a poem could grip you. I didn't know a poem could have a force. I was caught off guard because it was my intention to sit in that English class and merely fake that I liked poetry. Let me explain. I was in seminary up in Berkeley, but I was dating a woman who was a student at UC Santa Cruz, and I would drive down sometimes and attend classes with her. She loved poetry, and so I had gone down that day to go to a poetry class with her. I was faking like I liked poetry to impress her. Now that is not a noble thing, but I was 25 and I wanted her to like me. If fake it until you make it is true in the recovery movement, it's also true with poetry. I was faking it, but then it captured my heart. The poem, not the girl, we broke up 6 months later, but an appreciation of poetry awakened within me as it dwelled upon the eyes of the sleepers, as if to make amends. That poem by Rich is talking about moonlight and the way she personifies moonlight as a healing presence in our lives. It captured my imagination. I learned the power of poetry. This is a good thing, because do you know, 1/3 of our Bible is poetry. Fully 1/3. There are whole books that are poems. Job, Psalms, Proverbs, the Song of Solomon. Most of the Hebrew scriptures consist of vast swaths of poems. In Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, all the prophets. And there are poems that erupt out of nowhere in the New Testament. It's everywhere in our Bible. Our gospel begins with a poem, the Gospel of John. Listen to its opening verses. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The darkness shall never overcome it. Poetry. Beautiful poetry. It pops up everywhere. You can be reading the New Testament and you suddenly bump into a love poem. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not arrogant or rude or boastful. Love does not insist upon its own way. Love believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. There's poetry everywhere. But get this, ministers aren't trained in poetry at all. This is a huge oversight. It's like not training an electrician to use copper wire. I mean, the electricity of Scripture is found in the poetry. But we don't train ministers in poetry at all. Such an oversight. So much of our Bible, poems. It's become very ironic to me now when you see a fundamentalist red-faced and clutching their scriptures, thumping the Bible. You don't thump a book of poetry. You let it whisper to you quietly in moments of reverie. The Bible isn't about indoctrination, it's about inspiration. So much of it is poetry. Sometimes they say that poetry is in danger in America, that there isn't much appreciation of it. Poetry books sell maybe 28 copies, elite journals like the Hopkins Review or the Yale Review will have like 100 subscribers. People say poetry is gone now, but they're missing how much America loves the Bible. They're missing that there are some 380,000 churches, and pre-pandemic, some 60 million people would flock to church, and what would they hear? Poetry. Poetry is huge in America. I think you could almost imagine the faith itself as a poem. Oh, the faith itself sounds like it, does it not? In the fullness of time, a babe was born in the manger. The child grew in stature and wisdom and became a light among us, a light of truth and hope and faith. He so loved the world that he gave his life as a sacrifice that we might live fully reconciled with God and one another. This is a light that darkness cannot overcome. Doesn't the faith itself sound like a poem? I think of church a little bit like that great movie, The Dead Poets Society. And you come to church and you stand up on your pew and you say, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." We're embracing the truth of poetry. We're in a poem today in Isaiah 35. And I have to admit, when I first read this poem, I wasn't sure it was a good poem. I mean, well written. Well, let me explain. I have only written one poem in my entire life. This is a mournful thing in and of itself. I have only written one poem. It was a summer in graduate school. I was working at an institute for the developmentally disabled, severely. These were human beings that were of about 6-month intelligence level. Their bodies were contorted. They couldn't move or communicate. They could not move at all or communicate. And because I was in my 20s, I was able to do the transfers all day long, where you lifted up the person and hoping not to hurt them. You had to be very attentive to their arms and their legs, and that you weren't hurting them because they could not communicate at all. The head of that institute was a deeply spiritual woman who believed her mission was to bring a quality of life to these folks. And it was important to her that they got outside often to lay in the grass and feel the breeze and the sun. But you had to literally carry them very carefully and lay them down on a blanket. I wrote a poem from that summer trying to describe what it's like to hold someone who is suffering, but to not be sure you might hurt them in some other ways. And I tried to write a poem about that, but the poem, after I wrote it, didn't seem to honor their suffering or even their full humanity. I remember I tossed the poem away. It couldn't speak to the depth because I'm not a good poet. Well, when I first read Isaiah 35, I thought its euphoria was overdone. It's just gushing. It's squealing in delight. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. It just pours out this unabashed ecstasy. And I thought poems should be a little more restrained. But then I began to see the genius to this poem. You see, it's trying to seize a moment in time when alienation ends. This is a poem about the exiled Hebrews who now can return to Zion. And it's trying to seize just that moment when a human being feels that estrangement, that separation from who they really are to be, when that is healed, that moment. And so it gushes. It knows there'll be more suffering in the future. It knows that life is not perfect, but it's trying to have the ecstasy of that one moment. You know, you have to seize joy when you can. Particularly in this pandemic, this is something to remember. You have to be ready to celebrate something at any moment. You can't wait to have joy until everything is perfect in life or everything is all set up. Nothing in life will ever be all set up or perfect. So you have to seize the joy. That's what this poem is about. I said it's a poem about the end of alienation. Let me discuss for a moment the word alienation. It's a powerful word. It's talking about that feeling within a human being of estrangement or separation from what you most value or your true self. Alienation. So often now we use words like depression and anxiety, deeply meaningful words too, but those often are referring to brain chemistry and a health issue. Alienation is something different. It's when there really is something wrong, and it's an authentic reaction of the human being to suffer at that wrong. Alienation. When social scientists talk about alienation, they usually describe three major aspects. Alienation will include powerlessness, meaninglessness, and normlessness. Now, powerlessness. When a human being doesn't feel in control of their destiny. When a human being feels that things just happen to them and they can play no role in it. That powerlessness, that creates alienation. I know in this pandemic, we're feeling powerless, that we're not really in charge of our destiny. Events just seem to happen. We can be feeling alienation. But remember, my friends, we always have the power to choose how we will react. We may not be able to control macro events, but we can choose how we react. And we always have the power to do something. We may not be able to change large-scale events, but we can do something each day to make this a better world. We're not powerless. My dad used to talk to me all the time about being responsible, and that word sounds heavy. It sounded, when I was a teenager, a little judgy. He was always saying, be responsible. And then one day he says, hear the word. Turn the word around. When I say you need to be responsible, I'm talking about your ability to respond. Responsibility, your ability to respond. We always have that. And alienation comes from when meaninglessness takes over, when there doesn't seem to be anything coherent about the events or the things we're involved with. It doesn't make sense. We lose a sense of purpose. That's when alienation takes place. But remember, my friends, our sense of meaning, it can never just be given to you. You have to claim it yourself. Here, it is an act of the will to carve out meaning in your life. This is so much what the faith is trying to do. It's giving you a chance to carve out this meaning that there is a God, there is a higher purpose. We have to lay claim to our sense of meaning, or we will suffer alienation. And social scientists will talk about normlessness, that creates alienation. When there's no basic sense of norms in a society or a strong enough sense of common purpose, oh, my friends, we've been experiencing this. And we need to work all together to create again a sense of common purpose, that we do share the high ideals and all the partisan divides and all the cultural conflicts. we do share the most basic ideals and vision and hope. We can hold again to a common purpose. Oh, this poem. I didn't realize how great it was. The way it's speaking to an end of alienation, and then to experience the joy. But hear the true greatness of the poem. It's describing our God. Did you see that this is our God, a God that ends alienation? You might think of God sometimes as primarily judging, or God as all-powerful or wrathful. This poem reminds us our God is the reconciling God, the God that ends alienation, brings us back together, puts us at one with our best selves. Oh, hear this poem gush and take delight. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped, and the lame shall leap like a deer. The tongue of the speechless will sing for joy, for waters will break forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. This is our God. Amen.